from, there we go. You should get a notice of that.
Okay.
I love that it gives you the option to just not leave if you're uncomfortable with it being recorded. Obviously, I'm comfortable with it being recorded. I hope everybody else is. So I think, especially since Marcia has probably never seen this episode and has no idea what's going on, I think we're going to just start with kind of like a primer.
One, but not the rest. I saw all the original series, but not the first one, but nothing after that. So,
and this is and last week was the original series, and this week is the Next Generation.
Right. Okay. These are new for Susanna too. So,
so we're going to talk about who's important and who are the big players in the episode. One of the really great things about this particular episode is that it's so focused on such a small part of the Next Generation cast that, you know, there are not that many people that you have to worry about. So the first regular character we see is Dr. Crusher. She's the chief medical officer aboard the Enterprise D. And she has a great chat with Counselor Deanna Troi, who has, up until this point, and remember, this is season 7, this is the final season, mostly been a character in a supporting role. She cares for the crew's mental health, but in Thine Own Self, she expresses that she wants a little bit more in her life. And the next character that bears introduction, obviously, is going to be Data, and he's the star of our show. He's an android, which is why he has super pale skin and gold eyes. And throughout the Next Generation, Data tries his best to learn what it is to be human. And in part, he comes to represent the best of us. Finally, we meet Commander Riker, who is the ship's first officer and Troy's former love. During the bridge officer's test, you'll see Geordi LaForge, who goes to repair the conduit, and Worf, who is the Klingon security officer. The real important thing about them is that they're members of the senior staff and therefore very close to Deanna Troi. So those are the major Starfleet players. If you've seen the episode, then you know all the Barconians, but as a refresher, the Barconians are a pre-industrial civilization, so they have absolutely no familiarity with anything that Data represents. Thus, when he stumbles into their village, he gives them an image of something that's completely and entirely alien. And while I perhaps should focus on Data's very alienness, I want to begin actually by talking about Garvin. But before I go there, let's revisit the plot for a minute. Thine Own Self is structured to include two separate storylines. And that's a fairly common story structure for the Next Generation. And that's a trend that will actually continue all the way through Discovery here in 2022. The A story involves Data, who is sent to a planet, Barcon 4, in order to retrieve the radioactive wreckage of a probe that was pulled off course. Unfortunately, something causes Data himself to crash on the planet's surface, and in the process, he loses his memory. He stumbles into a random village, carrying a single box bearing the label radioactive, which unfortunately means nothing to him or anyone else in the village. He meets Garvin, who offers him help, and in so doing, Garvin actually opens the box containing the radioactive fragments, which obviously is a bad thing. Radiation poisoning being what it is. Garvin then takes Data home, where he and Gia find clothes for him and give him a new name, which will be Jaden. So going forward, I'll kind of alternate between using Data and Jaden, but they're generally the same actor, the same character. They even invite Talur, the village doctor / scientist, to come examine him. Once Talur identifies him as an Iceman, Garvin takes him to Scran, who's the village blacksmith and apparently jerk, to sell the mysterious fragments in order to generate funds. Jaden does, and eventually people in the village, including Garvin, begin to fall ill from a mysterious illness. Jaden investigates and discovers that the metal fragments emit some sort of energy particles, which he believes caused the illness. As he's working on a cure, Scran brings angry villagers, like a mob, y'all. He brings a mob. I mean, in as much as 1990s Star Trek and could afford a mob is what he brings. to Garvin's home, where they strike Jaden and they reveal the circuitry on his face. They flee, now convinced that he's some sort of demonic creature. Jaden hides in Garvin's home and enlists Gia's help, Gia being Garvin's young daughter, in both allowing him to continue searching for a cure for radiation poisoning with his medieval chemistry set. He does eventually manage to find a cure because he's magic, and he laces the village's sole water source with it. However, Skaran and that same mob of angry villagers, because again, we can't buy that many extras, find him at the well. They stab him with a huge stick, deactivating him. Later, Riker and Dr. Crusher will beam down to Barcon 4, disguised as Barconians, and they will retrieve Data's data, basically, for transport back up to the Enterprise, where he can be repaired. The episode's B story concerns Deanna Troi, who has decided to take the bridge officer's test, in part because she's come off a class reunion. And I defy you to say that you have never had this urge, okay? That you have never had the urge after being confronted with everybody else to be like, maybe I should have done something different. And she feels a little embarrassed and ashamed because she hasn't taken the bridge officer's test and gotten the promotion to full commander. She resolves to give it a try, and Riker points out that he'll beat her grader. She does impeccably well up until the engineering skills portion, which forces her to wrangle with a faulty antimatter containment conduit. Ultimately, everything she tries fails. The ship ends up destroyed in every single one of these simulations. And Riker, after about the fourth try, says, nope, we're done. I can't let you keep taking this test because you're just not getting it. And my first duty is to the ship. And I cannot let someone who's not capable of making the necessary choices on the bridge to command it. Troi suddenly has this epiphany. She realizes what he means. She goes back to the holodeck and starts the simulation. She asks LaForge directly if he can repair the conduit, averting the ship's destruction, and he admits that he can. However, doing so will cost him his life because the radiation in the conduit will be lethal. And Troi has to order him to his death. Riker comes in, halts the simulation, congratulates her on passing, but Troi doesn't feel very much like celebrating. Riker reminds her that she did what she had to do and what she should have done, which is evaluate her options and then make the hard call. In the end, she gets her promotion to full commander, and she gets to stand command watch on the bridge. So that's what happens in Thine Own Self. Last week, we talked a lot about what it means to be a neighbor, according to Jesus. And I think Garvin definitely qualifies. But before I get into that, I actually want to talk a little bit about stories and why they're so important. Delor is a character that I'm pretty certain the writers played for laughs, but I think we should give her a deeper look. Let's not overlook the fact that she's an important character in the village. She's the doctor. She's the teacher. She clearly has standing and authority. And at the end of the day, even if she's not entirely all square on how science works, she's still an advocate of science. So I think it's easy to discount Delor because she makes crazy pronouncements like Data has pale skin and gold eyes and is very strong. He must be an Iceman from the Valorian Mountains, because the Icemen have to battle fierce beasts in the Valorian Mountains. And mind you, no one has ever been to these mountains. No one has any idea if these beasts actually exist. But she's telling a story. And yeah, Data points out all the different logical flaws in her arguments. But, we're here because we are steeped in a story that's 2,000 and change years old. So again, let's not write off Delor because stories are incredibly important. They give us context. They afford us a framework to analyze a new situation. Yes, Delor's belief that Data is an Iceman is both unexamined and laughable, but she's telling a story that gives her something she can hold on to. There's a reason Jesus taught in parables. Excuse me, I'm dying. And because we, much like Talur, need that context and can actually learn better within the framework of a story than perhaps we do when things are explicitly spelled out for us. So sure, laugh at Talur, but remember that storytelling impulse is so inherent to who we are as a species that even God takes advantage of it. So speaking of stories, I want to get back to Garvin, because he's an excellent example of what a neighbor should be in the context of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Data wanders into the village looking nothing short of alien, and rather than reacting with fear, Garvin opens his heart, his home, and even his closet to this man with seemingly no expectation that Jaden will be able to repay him. Even when the rest of the village turns against Jaden Data, Garvin stands by him. He insists that he cannot believe this man would harm anyone. And frankly, y'all, that's amazing. Garvin would be well within his rights to suspect Jaden of being a disease vector, and even Jaden considers the possibility. However, Garvin just remains steadfast in his faith that in his friend. Sure, some of that's because he's not a terribly important character, but he's also a representation of what the best of us would look like, especially when juxtaposed with the character of Skoran. Really what he does for me, to bring it back to the Christian formation element of this, is that he lives what Jesus talks about in Matthew 25. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, come ye blessed of my father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Yep, King James Version, love the language. For I was an hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in, naked, and ye clothed me. Garvin quite literally takes Data and gives him clothes from his own closet and feeds him the meal he prepares with his own hands. Data was a stranger, and Garvin's first impulse is to help. I don't think the importance of that impulse can be overstated. Fred Rogers recalls that his mother would tell him to look for the helpers every time he'd see terrible things on the news, because there would always be someone helping. In light of the terrible things that we're currently faced with and are happening in the world, the simple impulse to reach out, to do unto the least of the brothers and sisters of Christ, is quite possibly the single most important thing we can do as Christians and as people. Star Trek may not be explicitly Christian, but to have a character like Garvin and to place him so prominently in an episode is a good reminder that at the franchise's heart lies a belief that we can do better and that we should do better. Jaden has also grasped the importance of helping, even atoning. Jaden lacks all of Data's memories, and he therefore has no recollection that the word radioactive is a warning. Yes, let's hand wave the ridiculousness of that particular selective linguistic failure. I'd argue that he is therefore not culpable for the radiation poisoning that devastates the village. In American jurisprudence, for someone to be criminally culpable, they must do the bad act, the actus reus, with the appropriately bad mind, the mens rea. Essentially what this means is that in order for your action to be a crime, the act alone is insufficient. You must have the appropriate level of intent. Jaden lacks any sort of intent here, so he's not criminally culpable. I'm not even necessarily sure he's negligent necessarily, but that's a long series of analysis that falls well outside of this evening's lecture. He is, however, responsible for the harm, and he embraces that responsibility even in the face of the villagers' blatant cruelty. Skoran assaults him, ripping away the false skin, but Jaden responds with kindness. I love Paul's first epistle to the Thessalonians for this. See that none render evil for evil unto any man, but ever follow that which is good, both among yourselves and to all men. Jaden, again, despite being the victim of violence and prejudice and fear, opts to look beyond the wrongs Skoran and his brethren visit upon him and continues to search and will find the cure. Sure, you can argue that Jaden wants to save Garvin and Gia here, but the point of the episode is to explore who Data is at his most base. The title comes from Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 3, and the actual quotation is, "This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. Shakespeare may have put these words in the mouth of the ridiculous Polonius, who is ridiculous, but make no mistake, Shakespeare is speaking directly to his audience, and we're going to ignore the theory that Polonius means for Laertes to put his own benefit first. So we're going to call this solid advice. And more to the point, even without his memories as data, Jaden chooses to do the right thing. He chooses not to repay evil with evil, and that choice defines who he is. The episode represents a subtle charge to make that same choice, no matter how difficult or costly it may be to us personally. Remember, Jaden dies. No matter that they manage to repair data, he has no recollection of being Jaden. So Jaden effectively sacrifices himself and all that he is to turn the other cheek. I do not mean to imply that the story is meant to be biblically inspired. Far from it. What's most important here is that the utopia requires of its citizens a commitment to making choices that benefit the largest group. In the parable of the Good Samaritan we discussed last week, the term neighbor encompasses that concept. This week, it's a question of being a sheep or a goat. For Star Trek, the least of these translates to the other, the alien. Data was an alien, but Garvin cared for him. Jaden survived violence only to follow that which is good to all men. Back to Troy. See, no, I hadn't forgotten her. Following that which is good requires asking her dear friend, Geordie LaForge, to sacrifice himself in order to save the ship. Here, the metaphor of sacrifice becomes explicit. In order for Troy to advance in Star Trek's utopia, she must recognize that her first duty is to the ship. The ship takes on a much broader meaning. It's both the Enterprise D and generalized to mean society as a whole. The message here then is that we must recognize an obligation to each other. For Troy, that involves making a rational decision about saving the largest number of people. For us as Episcopalians, Jesus tells us that no matter how alien or how poor or even how criminal that other might be, remember, Jesus refers to visiting one of the least of these in prison, we continue to have the obligation to treat that person or entity, in Star Trek's terms, the way we would treat Jesus himself. There's really no way to have a utopia without that sense of reciprocal responsibility. It's necessary for us to get into the kingdom of heaven, and it's just as necessary for the Federation to function. Looking forward to next week, I think atonement is very much part of this charge, and Lent really is the ideal time to reflect on these obligations. As Episcopalians, we confess our sins before God, before the Eucharist. The two most egregious that we recite are, we have not loved thee with our whole heart, we have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. If we're asking what loving our neighbor as ourselves means, or what doing unto the least of these means, it means identifying and following through on those reciprocal obligations. However, despite the examples provided to us in Jesus, Garvin, or Jaden, we know we'll stumble. And that's where atonement comes into play. Jaden atones for causing the villagers to fall ill due to his own ignorance, no matter that he's not exactly culpable. So next week, we're going to look at how one atones when one really is culpable. I know I've asked Mama Valerie to list 3 episodes of Voyager, a standalone and then a 2-parter for you to watch. But the real focus for next week is going to be the character of Lon Suter. Not to spoil anything, if in fact you can spoil something from the 90s, but sure, we'll go with it. Suter engages in some truly egregiously reprehensible activities. But the character of Tuvok believes that there may be something salvageable in Suter. If you get a chance to watch the episodes, I'd ask that you watch those episodes through that lens. And remember that atonement is part of satisfying the obligations that we not only owe each other, but also owe God. That's all I got. So let's move to the discussion portion.
All right. Thank you. See what I said?
That's what
I
I
tried
was
to go a little more slowly.
No, that was fine, Marie.
Mhm.
So, gosh, you touched on so many important points. The Christian narrative, we are a people of the story. And it's the story that guides us and corrects us and soothes us. And I love how you connected that and these two things. There's one of my favorite theologians, since I'm from Swanee. I graduated from Swanee, as Marie well knows. We were there at the same time for a little bit. It was awesome.
It was right after McClurg was constructed.
It was. I won't say what we called it.
Yeah, the Phallus Palace.
Well, that's a nicer way to say what we called it.
Look, I'm mellowing in my old age.
You are. I should be. Anyway, so Terry Holmes was a dean at Swanee and a theologian, and wrote the book What is Anglicanism? It's a fabulous book. I use it still for Christian formation. But he talks about tradition, the tradition of the church, scripture, reason, and tradition being the three legs of the stool that help us understand and interpret scripture. And he talks about tradition being the passing down from generation to generation within the community, the church's understanding of God's ways of understanding, God's ways with humanity. And it's the product of continuing reflection on the part of the church. And so it's living, changing. It's a living, changing body of thought. And
I
that
think
makes some people uncomfortable.
Tallulah also experiences that, because
Exactly.
even though she argues with data, and she talks about, the elements that one can find in wood, like there's rock in wood, there's fire in wood, blah, blah, blah. Right. What she does at the very end is she asks him to see his data. She asks, and she wants him to explain it, which is like the church. Tallulah is capable of learning. Stories are capable of changing. That's one of the great things about them.
But even in some of her discussions, when you're seeing her in the classroom, she tells the children, we used to think this, but now we know because of science. Now we know this other thing. But she's open to continually learning. And that's the blessing of being a people of story, is that the story continues with revelation, and there's continual growth within it. It is living.
I really like that. I am going to use that the next time this comes up.
You're welcome.
As part of how my story is going to evolve and change with revelation, because we definitely are people of stories. And and talking about stories is particularly important when we're talking about Star Trek, because Star Trek is ultimately a story. It's a story that we're telling each other about what we think our values are. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it sort of functions like the parable. It may be a little more complicated, since parables are meant to be pithy and relatively simply constructed, but it's still teaching something. And it's teaching that at the end of the day, you do have to make the right choice. And it's not always going to be easy, and it's not always going to be something that will not cost you anything. Right. But you still have to make that right choice, for, like the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few. You still have to make that choice going forward. Even when it costs you everything.
And Garvin exemplifies that. He somehow knew that Data was good. Well, Jaden was good. And even though all the evidence started pointing in the other direction, he maintained his position in the goodness of Data. And it's almost amazing that this lesser character, he's not he's not a yellow shirt or a blue shirt. He's not even a red shirt.
I think he has maybe like 2 paragraphs of lines in the 45 minutes.
Yeah, and he's not very smart, and he's caring for his community, but he is a minor, unimportant character. But isn't that the beauty of who he is? He's unencumbered by the expectations. And so he's able to see the truth and stick with it. Even when he's dying, he seems to be dying of a disease. He says he knows that
Not
this
Data.
person is fine.
Yeah.
He's a good person. He would never do this. And that is so close to the story of the Good Samaritan, who, you know, the person that nobody would have respected shows kindness and compassion in the same way Garvin did.
I mean, it's really kind of awe-inspiring in a certain sense. I mean, yeah, I get it. We had to have a character like this in order for, you know, Data to be able to survive in this context. But I mean, Garvin doesn't know Data from anything. He looks weird. He is dressed weird. And Garvin's just like, yeah, you're having a bad time of it. So why don't you come on home? And I'll take you and we'll get you straight and we'll figure something out. And that's so wonderful and so huge, and I think so difficult to do. Because again, like, Garvin has a small child and he's a single parent to Gia, because Gia's mother has passed away. Garvin has like a real risk. He takes this huge leap. I mean, I'd like to say that I would do that. That I would just be like, all right, this person I can do something. I have extra clothes. I can do whatever. I'll just bring them home. But now I have 3.5-year-old twins, and it's a game changer. And I have to be honest with myself that it is.
Susanna,
and I still haven't quite figured out where I'm coming out on that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Marie, for your beautiful interpretation of this episode into biblical context as well. I never watched Star Trek series, but this afternoon I went and watched this video, the episode, and I really fell in love with the characters in there. And I like the fact how you brought about this Christology element, how this Data was being received by the father and son, being an alien, like how they gave him with the clothing, the food, and all that. My simple question is, like, the episode is titled as Thine Own Self. So how do you relate that to the characters you've explained? Thine own self, does that mean that they remain in their own identities as you tell their stories? Or because of the impact or influence of this data that they tend to change and become different? Because some of the things, when I see the mob coming, I can only picture the Pharisees stopping Jesus doing a good thing, So some of the things I was just connecting and relating like that. So how do you connect this thine own self? What is your definition, biblically, when you see, what does it mean, thine own self?
Ooh. I'm going to defer to literally everyone on any sort of biblical allusions. Like, I'm really great with Star Trek. The theology I'm going to leave for the experts, you and Mama Valerie. But I think what the episode is trying to do is indicate that even without all the things that make him Data, his memories, his experiences, the things that he's been taught, at his base level, he's a good person, and he acts on that goodness. Because like I said, the title comes from, this above all, to thine own self be true. So he doesn't forsake any of that. And Troy is also being true to herself, because she's gone through this whole period. And unfortunately, there's a lot of the story arc that I can't really encompass in a single episode for Troy. But Troy's been going through these experiences where she's being taken out of her comfort zone, and she's discovering that she wants a little more, and that she's allowed to have that little more, and that it doesn't represent a betrayal of who she is.
Right.
That's kind of where it's where I would go with that. Anybody else?
I'm going to ask Gnann to start writing in the chat because she has written a little bit, but as an English professor or teacher, she can speak to this Shakespearean connection to this, to thine own self be true. Gnann, you got anything to say?
Nothing I've been put on the spot.
I know.
I'd forgotten I had my phone on actual noise. I'm a good millennial. Normally it's on silent.
Shakespeare serves as a source of tremendous wisdom.
Yeah, I'm going to need you to be more specific, Mom. We're not going to let you get away with this kind of like general statement. Yes, Shakespeare is a source of tremendous wisdom, but like, what is the tremendous wisdom you're seeing here? Also, I
She's
really
typing.
love getting to toss this back to my mom.
I have to admit, Hamlet is my least favorite of the tragedies.
Y'all know she's just messing with me.
Okay, but get serious, Gnann. So
You heard Mama Valerie. Come on, Mama.
you are my child. I have claimed that too. What I found fascinating in the concept of to thine own self be true in the context of the Shakespearean approach is that Data didn't even know, he had no awareness of his self. His self was gone. He couldn't remember it when he was Data again. He couldn't remember what happened
Yeah.
when he was Jaden.
Yes.
But in the big picture, looking at this character, he did stay true to himself. Oh my God.
Yeah, we are going South Georgia real fast here.
He did stay true.
Janet's
He
about
was.
to judge us all.
He did stay true, even though he didn't know who that
Kind of like
was.
his own humanity, basic humanity, he didn't lose.
Mm.
And
there was
he
Which is
something
funny
there.
because he's
Right.
not
Right.
human.
Right.
But there was something there.
A good
Yeah,
one.
there's something like inherent to him, and I think and I think that's a great way to use Data as a character, because he, in some ways, he serves as a mirror. And one of the things I really love is that he reflects what is best in us.
Yes.
And I mean, I'm a big believer in self-knowledge and acknowledging your own flaws. Good point. Mom brings up the concept of, is he a mirror or a lens? I think mirror is probably better because he's reflecting that goodness back at us, and we have to live up to it.
I like her statement right before that Data continues throughout his character, throughout the series, continues searching for human truth. And the amazing thing is what he keeps finding, what he keeps sharing with the humans around him is divine truth.
Valid. Just as a side note, one of my favorite things about this episode is how Dr. Crusher explains what happened to Data. And she's like, well, you saved a whole bunch of people, but more important than that, you were a special friend to a little girl. And what does that say about, the value system here?
Yeah.
Which is just a great little touch.
Because he had an innocence that was reflected in that child. Their innocence played off each other, and he never violated it, not in himself and not for her.
She also said something. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
Or just when I don't remember the names. When people from the starship came down and said, "Where's Data? Or where is he?" And she told them, and they asked, "Why did they do that?" And she said, I thought this is really interesting. She said they were afraid.
Yeah.
She didn't say they were bad men. She didn't say they had
Right.
an argument. She said they were afraid. And I just thought, is that, I don't know, that statement just spoke to me. That they were
Wisdom.
afraid. Yeah.
Because I think and I think you're right. I think that's hugely important. It's not, again, like they're acting out of fear. And when we talk about good or bad, it's a much more complicated question Like, why are you doing something? I mean, you can perform a bad act and still not be a bad person.
Right.
Although I would argue that Skoran is a bad guy. Like, he tries to swindle Data earlier. And he's like, oh, no. I gave you 15 coins for that.
Yeah.
No, you gave me, it was 20. So I think Skoran is generally supposed to be just a bad dude, but but the rest of them, not so much.
But doesn't fear do that to people in general?
I don't know that Skoran really was afraid of him until Data picks the anvil up off of that guy.
Right. Right.
And suddenly everybody's just like, woo. I also really love where they put Data's memorial in his body. Yeah. Some of it is obviously that they don't want to have to build like an entirely new set. But they could have done this by having a whole conversation about it. They didn't have to show it here. What's important is that he's in the village's central square.
Right.
They have decided as a people to remember both his sacrifice and their own responsibility for it. Because this is where school is. This is where you go to, have civic speeches. This is your standard town square, folks. Jaden's story, if we can go back to the narrative concept, Jaden's story is going to be passed down, and Gia is the one who is going to tell that story, which I think is the most important part, because it indicates that sacrifice, that goodness, is perpetual. It can be perpetuated. And I think that that's a hugely important choice, because I think we also have to choose how we conceive of the narratives that we tell each other and ourselves. Oh, that person has treated me poorly. That person keeps saying bad things about me. That's what I'm getting because I have an emotional tie. I've made an emotional value judgment about this, and that keeps me from listening. And what I'm actually doing there is I'm not actually hearing what's being said so much as I'm hearing what I want to, right? So if you flip the narrative and you say, all right, maybe there's a different goal here. Maybe this is either a miscommunication, or maybe I'm just not hearing good advice. And so when you flip that narrative, you flip your entire perspective and you find yourself far more open. So I think in the village, the narrative of Jaden being, having purposefully brought plague to their village gets flipped when he dumps the magic cure into the well. And I can't watch this episode with my husband because he gets very, very angry because he's just like, radiation poisoning does not work that way.
We all have our biblical literalists to deal with.
Oh man. Because my husband actually used to deal with nuclear weapons. And so they spent a lot of time talking about radiation poisoning. And I'm like, please don't share, honey. I don't need nightmares. I don't. Like, I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and it vaguely glows at night because they keep accidentally dropping warheads on the mountain.
So Gnann makes a couple of really good points. The child.
I didn't even see that, Mom. Like, I didn't even see that. I did not steal that from you.
Willing suspension of disbelief. But
so who was the willing suspension of disbelief?
About the child and the innocence of openness. A child is open And most of us, as we grow up, we start building walls, self-protective walls. And if the child, and I think Gnann is right, the child obviously does represent the future. It has to be one of openness and innocence. And the scriptural reference, of course, is, "In a child shall lead them."
Yeah, I didn't even get there. So these discussions are super great. We haven't actually we haven't really talked about Troy and having to what she experiences in this episode. So there's a line she makes. There's a line in there where she talks about a no-win situation, and that is actually like a statement that's significant to Star Trek, because there's this idea of the Kobayashi Maru, which is ultimately a test that you have to take, and it's a no-win scenario, and you just have to embrace that. And it basically is testing what you do when you know you're going to die, or you know you're going to fail, whether you have the grace of character to stand up and still make the best choices you can in a situation like that. Why did you have to bring Wordsworth into it, Mama? Like, why? Why? We are already dealing with Hamlet. We do not need to deal with that crazy bearded man.
Well, you're right. Deanna actually says that without referencing the Kobayashi Maru. She references, "Is this my test of the impossible situation? Are you just testing me on that?" And without a reference to the entire series, that being, this is the case. She finds her way through. And so I want to mention, for Susanna's sake, that Deanna Troi is also not human. Well, she's part human, but she's an empath, so she can hear and has knowledge of people's feelings and so she's a counselor, and that's partly why she's a counselor. She can help that way. Of course, like anyone knows, a clinician can't treat themselves. But as she's confronting her own sense of inadequacy or failure to succeed in the way that she, coming out of her reunion, thinks she should have, she pushes forward and realizes that the place she brought herself is a place that she cannot be. She's an empath. She cares about people, and she cannot. There's a difference between being in an impossible situation and ordering somebody else to die.
I actually think it's so much worse what she has to do.
Exactly.
Because she's going to have to live with it.
I can sacrifice myself, but I can't ask anyone. I can't order someone else to do that. And that is the impossible situation.
Right. But what she ends up doing in that moment is she has to change her story. And her story has been that there is a way to get through this where everybody lives. Nobody has to make that sacrifice. I just have to find it. And when she doesn't, I mean, it takes her several iterations, right? She goes through this test 4 times. And you see several sequences of her with technical manuals and like a stylist and trying to figure out like what she can do.
Up here.
It's crazy, right? I mean, she's throwing herself into it, and it's making her crazy and cranky with Riker, frankly. But she's got to change that narrative. And years ago, my mother gave me this.
I love it, Gnann. Great.
It was this long-standing joke because I had this one version of success, like one version. And what Mom, and it lives on my desk drawer right here. Like
awesome.
It lives here so I can see it every day. That's not just because I was running out of places to put stuff, I swear. She has to change her narrative. She has to change her story. She has to recognize that the narrative she had doesn't work. So she's kind of like Talur here. It's a really interesting parallel between Talor and Troy, which is, I really do love how layered this particular story is, which is not something that you expect when you see Brent Spiner showing off his adherence to leg day in tights. Right?
All right.
Does this change represent character growth in its purest form?
Indiana.
I don't know, Mom. What do you think?
Yeah. What do you think, Gnann?
That's why I asked.
So let's talk about what is this shift in her, this change in her character. She went from being concerned about herself and her success to being concerned about the bigger picture of the community she would be charged to care about, to care for, to protect. And so the sacrifice was actually hers. It wasn't her sacrifice of Geordie. It was her sacrifice of her understanding of how to live in the world.
Yeah, and I love what Mom says here is that she loses some of her idealistic naivete.
Yeah.
I think she sacrifices it,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing that she does, obviously, because there are things you can afford to have on the bridge of a starship or any other like significant being in charge of whatever role. Apparently my words are failing me today. And things that you can't have. And, you have to be able to, if I may grab the sign again, redefine success. And you have to be open to that and flexible. But you still, at the end of the day, have to recognize the reciprocal obligations you have to other people in your community, whether it's on the bridge of a starship or if it's your neighbor, literal neighbor.
So before we get to Gnann's last question, that point you just made, Marie, is so amazing because it goes back to our baptismal vows, to our Eucharist, C, isn't it? One body, one spirit in Christ. And if you redefine success, if we start with how we understand success as people, us here as a community, and then we look at how does God define success, then we see a real divergence. And what Deanna Troi was faced with was which version of success would she go with? The one that glorifies her or the one that serves the people?
So I think now we get to answer Mom's question.
Go ahead.
The roads that diverge. I swear to you, if you have brought Wordsworth into this, you are now bringing Robert Frost into this. You are grounded. You are not invited back.
Didn't she bring Robert Frost in earlier? She brought Robert.
She did. That's literally, she's like, we haven't acknowledged it. So she's going to make us acknowledge it.
She brought it back.
It all comes back to Robert Frost. Oh, and there were two roads, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Mrs. Burns would still judge me for not remembering all of that, but oh, that's why. That's why you taught Frost. I think, and I would actually argue that an empath would make a good leader. Because an empath would be aware of their subordinates in a way that I think a lot of leaders aren't. So I'm watching, I mentioned that I'm watching Star Trek Discovery, and one of the characters, Michael Burnham, there's been this whole conversation, this whole arc about would she be a good captain or not? And one of the things that has happened is now that she's finally captain of her own ship, she has decided that she's going to do this with the greatest amount of transparency. And that includes working with this other lady that she doesn't get along with. But that lady, in turn, they've had to figure out how to support each other because they've realized that people who aren't supported don't do their best work. I know this is a revelation. It's not, but it's not. But I think we forget, especially as Americans, because we live in a low context culture. Even Southerners comparatively live in a low context culture, vis-a-vis other places in the world. And we tend to be a little more individualistic minded. So I think it's hard to remember that these are communities, that our workplaces are communities, and that the best way to get the best product is to make sure that everybody is supported, because a rising tide lifts all boats.
And I would suggest that I would agree with you, Marie, that an empath would make a good leader.
Yes, really, Mom.
Isn't that, yes, really. Isn't that what Jesus demonstrated over and over again? The woman who was being stoned for adultery, all these, everywhere you go, he hears the voice that is whispering pain and subjugation and oppression. And he makes that voice important in everything he does. So I suppose then not only do we have to redefine success, we have to redefine leadership. And given that, Holy Week is coming, Maundy Thursday does a really good job with that. He wasn't a king or a David. He tied a towel around his waist and washed feet. That would be a successful leader for us in our story.
I would argue in any story, really. Like, we should learn from that.
Hopefully.
I say this as someone who has spent far too much time in law firms where it's very much like herding spiders. And there is no concept of support.
Venomous spiders or just plain old spiders?
That depends on the day. Considering that I worked for my dad at one point, I'm going to call them venomous. But we have hit 6:30.
Goodness.
And unfortunately,
you're here.
well, right. But it's 6:30 for me, and unfortunately, I have to go help with bedtime for the 3.5-year-old munchkins. So next week, I know it's a lot. I know it's a lot. But if you have to only watch 2, I would watch the standalone episode. And I can't remember the name of it.
So you gave me 2. I'm not sure I had 3. Let me go back.
Yeah. So the basics is a 2-parter. There's a part 1 and part 2. So that's why it's 3 episodes.
So meld basics 1 and basics 2. Yeah. Those are the 3. Okay. Yeah. I'll look that up.
The most important is meld, and then I'd argue the end of basics. But if you want to skip all of that, you can actually, there's a site called Memory Alpha, and you can look up the parts that we're going to talk about, which is basically just lawn suitor, because a lot goes on in both of those episodes that I think is not, and I want to focus actually on the arc he has in those 3 episodes.
Okay.
We're watching all 3.
If that makes any sense.
We're watching all 3, he says.
I don't know. I mean, is it just Star Trek and that's the name of the?
Okay, so it's going to be Star Trek Voyager.
Okay.
The cool part is this is Captain Janeway, so it's the first female captain in Star Trek.
Catherine Janeway, right?
In fact,
Mimi was putting the names in the newsletter, which goes out tomorrow, so I'll get her to correct basics 1 and 2 and add meld to it. And if y'all don't have a way to watch it free, I do, and so we can always meet and watch it together.
It's on Netflix.
It's on Netflix.
I think so.
It's also on Hulu and Prime. I've been watching them on Netflix. Yeah,
I think so. I've been watching it on Paramount Plus, which I have for
I don't have it.
Semi-professional reasons. Slash a deep obsession with Star Trek that has never quite gone away.
Guilty. Marie, thank you so much. Gnann, it was so lovely to get to see your text, not your face.
Next time you gotta get that camera fixed, Mom.
Yeah, please do. And Marcia, it's lovely to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Janet and Susanna, thank you so much for coming. And we're going to post, Marie was very kind to record her part of what we did last time. So we don't have the discussion, but we will have a link to a video of her giving her portion of that. And so we'll have this one, and we're going to post these. I had some people who are going to the other formation option, the evangelism one, who wanted to also have this one. So we'll be sharing this.
And if they have questions, I mean, certainly like collect them and we can talk about them here.
Yeah. Okay. We'll talk about them without them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they can watch it later. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine.
Thank
All
you
right,
all
y'all.
so much.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for giving me this platform. And I will see you later.
Live long and prosper. Bye.